at the Asia Roundtable, you brought a point that the status quo between Taiwan and China has been blurred, and China is looking for a new line. So, against this backdrop, let me ask my first question to you. What has contributed to the blurring of the status quo between Taiwan and China, and how would China like it to be redefined? Over to you, Aadil.
So in my talk, I tried to highlight how the three parties of this Taiwan Strait crisis, that's Beijing, Taipei, and Washington, D.C., have blurred the status quo which lasted in the Taiwan Strait for almost 20 years. All the three parties have tried to make use of a geopolitical climate where they try to extend their interest. And within that climate, all the three parties have blurred that line, which allowed all the three parties to maintain a strategic ambiguity over the question of Taiwan, which was supposed to be settled in the future, whether it is the ties between Beijing and Taipei, where both agreed that they can continue doing business by not unsettling the current status and allowing exchange of people and goods across the strait. Similarly, US and China had their own understanding over Taiwan, which lasted for some time. And that whole status quo is now unsettled, and we are trying to figure out how these parties will come to a new kind of status quo. Though there is rhetoric about war as well, which seems unlikely in the current context, but that doesn't mean Beijing is not considering that option. The PLA is preparing for that option as well. But the more likely scenario is some kind of status quo, a stalemate that could emerge from the current environment.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Can you just can you highlight few points on what constitutes this status quo, if you had to point few?
The status quo between Beijing and Taipei can be looked at from a few perspectives. So there's one aspect, that's the economic exchange between Beijing and Taipei, the companies in the coastal areas of China, whether it's Fujian or Shenzhen, having deep business ties with Taiwan, and similarly, Taiwan's Taishan community having deep ties with the mainland. And so these ties allowed people to move back and forth, as well as cultural ties to go on. Most recently, the former Taiwanese president, Ma Ying-jeou, was in the mainland. He's going through a sort of a trip which was planned for some time, and it's finally happening. He's paying respect to his elders, so that's part of the Chinese culture. So he's using this rhetoric of Chinese culture to bring together Beijing and Taipei. Though a lot of Taiwanese are not happy with the visit, they believe that he is undermining the idea of a Taiwanese identity, which the Taiwanese themselves have worked on for a long time. But that doesn't mean there isn't another section of society within Taiwan which wants to maintain ties with the mainland, and that's what's allowed these exchanges to continue.
Oh, thank you. Now I come back to my fundamental question, which is on India's approach towards the crisis. So, how has India approached Taiwan crisis historically? And if there was a war to happen in a very hypothetical situation, what will be the scenario for India?
So India and Taiwan have had direct or indirect, sometimes official and unofficial ties since 1995. That's when the India-Taipei Association was established in Taipei. That's the model a lot of countries adopted after they severed ties with Taiwan, something that Canada initially began. So following that model, New Delhi's had unofficial ties with Taipei, and that's allowed India to maintain ties for business exchanges. Companies like Acer and Asus, which are Taiwanese companies, have deep presence in India. And so these companies have been in India for a long time. And similarly, Taiwan has been trying to attract Indian talent so that they can go work in Taiwan, especially engineering talent, which can be critical to the Taiwanese industries. So these exchanges have happened underneath a kind of geopolitical environment where India had ties with Beijing at the same time with Taiwan. Though New Delhi has been cautious about using the Taiwan connection, but we know for a long time, at least since 2009, there's not been a mention of one China policy by the MEA, and so which seems to be a deliberate attempt to kind of change a relationship with Taiwan, giving Taiwan relationship more space. Though it remains unofficial, but the exchanges have continued to grow, and Taiwan is doing that as well under its own southbound policy by exchanging with India and other South Asian countries.
Okay, perfect. So in the conversation that we had at the Asia Roundtable, one of the conclusions that was drawn that Taiwan contingency is also Indian contingency, and I think in your recent shorts also you explained that. So could you highlight more on it?
The reason I believe a Taiwan contingency will be an Indian contingency is because if you look at the PLA rhetoric that's coming out, the People's Liberation Army is talking about manning the borders. So if we examine that rhetoric, they're talking about how they want to man the border with India as well as the Taiwan context, which is far more important for Beijing than the tensions Beijing has with New Delhi. So if in the future Beijing has to approach a military option, they will be kind of caught up in the Taiwan Strait, but at the same time they will be concerned about what happens vis-a-vis the border with India, where India or some of the other countries could try to ratchet up tension. So I think Beijing is mindful about these scenarios where, if they have to go for the military options, they have to do something about the border as well. So the tensions that India and China have experienced for the last 2 years, we can't say that they are not somewhat connected to what's happening in the Taiwan Strait. Beijing has a overall strategy of securing the borders, and that's how New Delhi's concerns and Taipei's concerns are somewhat linked. So we can say that in the future, if there is that Taiwan contingency, there will be overlap of interest with what India thinks about its own security interest at the border, and that's where there might be some convergence between New Delhi and Taipei.
Okay, so in your answer, I think you mentioned about New Delhi hasn't used one China policy post 2009. Can you explain more on what might be the underlying statement behind this?
I think the reason New Delhi has not used that particular phrase or that statement is because Beijing has stopped respecting New Delhi's interest in terms of the territorial sovereignty and integrity when it comes to Arunachal Pradesh, because Beijing mentions Arunachal Pradesh to be part of its own territory. And because of that rhetoric, New Delhi's realized that if the other side is not respecting its own, its interest. So New Delhi has to do something about expressing its own discomfort with recognizing Taiwan to be, part of PRC. So that is where New Delhi is approaching, this whole issue of recognition of territory. And New Delhi feels that PRC is not respecting its own interest, and that is why they've stopped using one China policy. And since 2009 and in recent years, we've seen these border tensions have escalated. So New Delhi considers this one China policy to be a tool by not recognizing and by not using it in the official statements. It sends a message to the PRC that your own interests might be under threat, something that New Delhi and Beijing have maintained for a long time. So if you escalate the tensions, we have other options available to reply with the diplomatic response that New Delhi has had.
Thank you. Coming to the technological front, I mean, India-Taiwan relationship has grown over the years on the technological front, and there is a buzz around TSMC setting up its unit in Delhi. In India, basically. So the Indian media broke the news last month saying that it was a go. However, the inside narrative seems to be very different. I think the Taiwanese side does not find very conducive environment in India for TSMC to set up a manufacturing unit here. So where do the fault lines lie in this whole saga?
If we carefully look at the TSMC interest in investing in India, there are certain concerns that the company has, especially about not having enough technical staff available, trained staff in India, because the TSMC or the semiconductor supply chain is quite complex, and India may not have those systems available yet to back a complex operation that TSMC wants to set up. So that is why we've had more success with other kind of operations by Taiwanese companies like Foxconn. Foxconn is manufacturing Apple products in India. That's been a success. But with TSMC's interest in investing in India, there are concerns about availability of a basic kind of infrastructure, which is critical to the semiconductor industry: supply of water, staff, setting up the equipment, and all those things are so crucial that it's something India has not been able to come up with yet. So if you look at the TSMC factory, which was set up in Arizona, there was a good amount of back and forth between what US wanted and what Taiwan wanted. And eventually Taiwan sent their own engineers to the US and gave them that kind of environment that the Taiwanese would seek, which allowed that plan to come up after a lot of negotiations. We'll have to see how successful that operation is. But India has not been able to provide that environment as of yet to convince TSMC to set up that operation here.